I've stalled as long as I can, apparently, according to Jason. It's time for us to get going. We will start tonight with a brief review of last week's class discussion regarding lying. Before I get going into that, I've asked Alex to lead us in a word of prayer.
Our good God and Father in heaven, we thank you for the time that we have tonight to gather with our church family and to study a portion of your word. We ask that you give us wisdom as we learn to control our tongues and help us to glorify you and to build one another up, especially with the tools that we have and that we're learning in this class. We ask that you be with the many here that need you, whether it be spiritually or physically, who are struggling. Help us as their family to be pillars for them to lean on and to help them in whatever way we can. Please bless us all tonight. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, brother. So, last week's class generated more questions after class and in the ensuing week than any class I've ever taught. Ever. A lot of interesting questions, and I'm very glad of those. We'll touch on a couple of those tonight, but if you remember, this was last week's application question, and we kind of finished off with that, and then after we had that discussion is when we started to get some different scenarios, and anytime you start getting different scenarios about what ifs, those are difficult, and so some of these are kind of stumpers that we'll talk about here in a moment, but we finished off with this discussion of is it ever okay to lie, using the principles that we had talked about earlier in the class. So I just want to refresh our minds a little bit, remind ourselves briefly what God tells us His opinion on lying is directly from the Scripture. So if you'll remember, we turned to Proverbs the 6th chapter, and Proverbs the 6th chapter, beginning in verse 16, it says, "There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to Him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers." We noted that there are at least 2 of those, maybe 3, really had to do with sins of the tongue, specifically about lying. It's an abomination to God. In Proverbs, just turn over about 3-4 chapters there, Proverbs the 12th chapter, and verse 22, he lays it out again. "Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are His delight." And then we turned over to Revelation, the 21st chapter, Revelation 21, and in verse 8, and we noted that in Revelation 21, verse 8, there's this list of those who are going to wind up in the lake of fire. "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." And so that's what we discussed last week that God says about lying. Does anybody know of another verse that I am missing that says anything different than that? Speak now. I don't know of any other opinion that God holds for lying that's told to us in the Scriptures. It is an abomination to Him. He hates it and would never support it. I think we can all agree on that, unless I'm missing something. We talked about some examples of lying in the Bible. One of those that came after class was the description, if you'll go to Exodus, the first chapter. In Exodus, the first chapter, we didn't cover this one in class, but it was brought up to me afterwards. What about the midwives? What about the midwives? So you have here in Exodus, the first chapter, beginning in verse 15, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, 'When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and set them and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, 'Why have you done this?' Why have you done this and let the male children live?' The midwives said to Pharaoh, 'Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them.' So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. And obviously in chapter 2 we get the story of Moses, and kind of off we go. So what do you think of that? Yes, sir.
I think it's civil disobedience.
So civil disobedience, I think of it as they are acting out exactly what the apostles acted out in the book of Acts, where they said, we got to obey God other than men, right? They feared God, they acted on, they feared God, and they didn't kill those baby boys. They didn't let that happen. I think of it not so much as acting out, like their purpose was to act out against the government. Their purpose was, hey, I can't do this sin. This is wrong. This is not what God wants me to do. Other thoughts on that? Yes, Matthew? We don't. So that's an interesting point. So what we have is the midwives feared God, didn't do. The king of Egypt, they didn't do as the king commanded them. And what was it that the king had commanded them? If it is a son, you shall kill him. That's what they didn't do. They didn't kill him. So the king of Egypt called the midwives, why have you done this, and let the male children live? And they said, hey, so maybe that is the case. It doesn't feel like that's the case, but maybe that's the case. But anybody else have a thought on that? Yes? Yeah, so they gave an excuse as opposed to, hey, I just didn't do it. They gave an excuse that says the reason they didn't kill him was that those babies were born without him, essentially. You get that? Yeah, so you look at verse 19. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So they're popping out the baby boys before the midwives could get to them. Does that happen? Yeah. I've delivered babies in elevators and pickup trucks. It happens. I have to tell you about that one later. Yeah. Completely ruined this guy's Ford seats. So anyway, they were velour. I'm like, well, yeah. Okay, so bottom line, we're not told exactly. I think it's easy to get to. I think it's easy to look at that and say, were they just making an excuse, or did God have all those babies come, the baby boys, come before the midwives would get there? You don't really know. Certainly a possibility. Joshua 2. Joshua 2 we did look at last week. In Joshua 2, this is the story, of course, of Rahab. Joshua 2, verses 1 through 6. Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly. We know the story. It was told to the king in verse 2, men of Israel have come in. King of Jericho sent to Rahab, bring out the men. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. Is that true? That's not true. I don't think we can hedge our bets on that one. That was not true. And yet, we know that she is praised later that her faith was reckoned righteousness for what? For the lie that she told, or for the action that she took? For the action that she took. She, again, feared God and acted that way because it was not right. She knew, she had faith in God, that God was the true God. She even mentions that. God was the true and living God. And then she asked for them to deal kindly with her. 1 Samuel 20, we talked about David and Jonathan, where they construct this kind of complicated lie to kind of fool King Saul, and for David to kind of show to Jonathan that King Saul truly did have murder in mind for him. So those are some examples that we talked about, and then the one that we hadn't talked about. There are others in the Bible as well. Let's go. Yes, did you have something else? Yeah.
Whatever people have done or said does not negate the fact that God hates lying.
Yes, that is exactly right.
It has nothing to do with the way that God still feels about it.
That is the point that we were trying to make last week, that David is a great example. Man after God's own heart, but a flawed man like we are. Sinned in many ways. That did not negate the fact that he was a man of repentance and that he was a man after God's own heart. Stephen, you had something?
I was just thinking about Genesis 42, when Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. So he didn't correct a misperception of him. It's not as if Joseph was lying. He was going to use this opportunity for examination, to examine the intentions of his brothers. But for him not to immediately reveal himself and say, "Hey guys, I'm Joseph," I don't know. That doesn't. I don't think he's lying. I just want your opinion on that.
No, it's one of those things where the what ifs, right? Like what was his intention? What was he trying to? He was using that as you said to get at their hearts and where they were coming from. But if they had asked him, "Hey, are you my brother?"
Exactly. But he didn't reveal it. He didn't just come out with it. I don't think he needed to.
Yeah.
He wasn't lying. By just okay. Well, he is in that position. They came to him in that position. It's a very.
Was he deceptive?
What's that?
Was he deceptive?
I don't believe he was deceiving them. I don't think he was like pulling one over on them to harm them or cause destruction or.
I don't think he had ill intent,
No.
but I don't think he was. I think he was deceptive. I just don't see how you get around that. He did he withheld information. That's kind of the definition of deceptive. Then again, it wasn't with evil intent. These are the difficult situations where you say what ifs, and we have a lot of information that's in the scriptures, but we don't have all the information in the scriptures about everything that they said, all the interactions that they had, things that were not said that are not portrayed in the Bible. But we do know what God feels about lying. We know what He feels about lying. In Revelation 2, verses 8 through 11, He says, "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write the words to the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." What are we expected to be ready to sacrifice? Our very lives, our physical lives. And what is considered to be worth more than our physical life? Our spirit, our soul, our salvation. That being said, these are some of the questions that were brought to me afterwards, and I got to tell you, that's why I use the word conundrum. What does conundrum mean? It's a difficult or confusing question, right? Could you hide Jews during the Holocaust? Should you keep the fact that Santa Claus is not real? Or the Easter Bunny? I saw this really funny cartoon once where it had this lady who was pulling her kids out of the front building of the church, and the minister was standing there, and he's got this shocked look on his face, and the caption at the bottom said, "Preacher so-and-so destroys the myths of Santa Claus and Easter all in one sermon." And the mom was really, really mad, obviously, about what he had done. So let's just address these, because these are questions that you will get. Let's think about the hiding Jews during the Holocaust. Could you do that? This is an example, in my mind, of one of those questions that's not a yes or no question. Right? This is actually a very complicated question, and you should feel comfortable saying to someone, this is not a yes or no question. This is actually very, very complicated. And the purpose is not to give a history lesson here, but I just want to illustrate for the purposes of this. Fascism in Germany really started in 1923, failed rebellion in Munich, right? And then over the next 10 years, after Hitler was, by the way, this is the 80th anniversary of the death of Adolf Hitler today. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, 80 years. Hitler came to power really in the 1920s, and the Nazi Party gained members in the legislation of the Reichstag, the legislature, over those 10 years to the point where they had the most number but didn't have a majority, and so the president appointed Chancellor Hitler as the chancellor, and then the president died a year later, and then Hitler had all the power. And so in the early 1930s is when he really started to enact all these incredibly evil policies, evil policies that resulted in the deaths of millions of Jews, but not just Jews, other undesirables like Christians and gypsies and others who spoke out or acted out against the Nazi regime. And those people who spoke out early on as they were coming into power, what happened to those people that spoke out? They got killed. They were put into concentration camps or executed or both, right? So and you compare that to the apostles in Acts 5 that states that we clearly should obey God rather than men. I think German Christians would have had a very, very difficult time ignoring the evil actions of their government at that time. I can't even imagine what that must have been for a German Christian to be going through that situation. You think about your conscience as a Christian, if you were living in that situation and the overt evil that was going on and being perpetrated, I think my conscience would have allowed me to help those who were oppressed. I also think, though, that did not happen. That's the problem with this type of question. That did not happen in 1940. This happened over 10 years, 1923 and on. Why weren't we saying things in the 1920s and 30s? How did that guy even get to power? If you go back and look at the history of that, it's because people didn't say things. They were scared, and the Treaty of Versailles, they were mad about the Treaty of Versailles. They were mad about how Germany was treated after that, and how Austria was treated after that. But they didn't say anything. They didn't say anything. And so, yeah, I think that my conscience would have allowed me to harbor Jews or harbor those or hide people who were about to be killed by an evil government. I think I could. But I think my conscience would have told me, or should have told me also, that I needed to speak out before that happened. That those who preached, that those judges who were accepting of that should have spoken up. And some did. You may have heard names of like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others. What happened to them? They were killed. They were executed. They were put in concentration camps. Or I might have buried my head, as most Germans did, and just tried to survive. That's what the majority of them did. And that's how the Nazis came to power. When I think about that situation, I think it's very similar to Rahab. Right? Rahab, she didn't have the Old Testament. She didn't have the Ten Commandments. She didn't witness the parting of the Red Sea. She didn't see the 10 plagues. But she heard and saw what was going on and had faith in the one and true living God, that she had to obey, and rather than giving up those spies. And I think about the apostles, Peter and John, stating that they couldn't help but speak the truth of the things that they had witnessed, regardless of the circumstances. We talked last week about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were faced with the most severe consequence because they refused to sin, even if it cost them their lives. And that's what we find in Revelation, that we're expected to, even if it costs us our lives. So could you hide Jews during the Holocaust? I think that's it's a question that you would have to answer for yourself, but I look at that and I go, I have to obey God rather than men. If I knew that person was going to be killed or executed, and that's an evil act of those people, I think I could. If somebody asked me, hey, are you harboring Jews? I would have to answer very carefully to avoid lying, to get myself, and that might cost me my life. And I don't know if I would have the courage to do that back then. I hope that I would. I pray that I would, but I don't know. I've never been faced with that situation. On a much lighter note, Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. Questions, thoughts about that or comments about that? Yes?
I would compare that scenario for the Christians who got Peter. out of the city whenever he was threatened with potentially death, right?
Or lowered Paul down the wall
Yeah, Lord,
in Damascus.
it was, we can never answer that because, hopefully we don't have to have that in our lifetime, but certainly they got them where they needed to go and got them out. I don't know anything about lying for that, but I would say that, you don't help your government kill people.
You don't,
You listen to God before you ever listen to government.
Ryan?
I'm just going to say, I would have a hard time talking and maybe respecting someone that said that they couldn't harbor Jews. It's like, what is the point of your faith then? Like, what have you learned? It'd be very easy to give someone up. Oh, I can't lie. There they are right there. Like that's hard. When I was deployed, we were on a small base, and the local police force that we were assigned to kept kidnapping children and raping. And we almost got in a gunfight with them because we took back a kid. And we got in a lot of trouble for that. And we were told, hey, you don't interfere, that's an Afghan problem. You let Afghans deal with it. And after that, and that was a direct order. And we're told, we just together, it's like, listen, like, we'll all lose our commission, it doesn't matter, but we're not going to just not do something. And that's one of those things that, like, what's the point of your faith then? You're just not going to do it. So, whatever.
I appreciate that very much. You've been faced with a real situation that I haven't. And yes, Tanya?
I think I'm kind of hearing a couple of things in this conversation. I'm not sure if anybody would oppose to, like, if you were to hide Jews or saving the kids. I think the question is, if you were asked and wording something carefully could be construed as deception, because it's really a yes or no answer. Now,
It's not really. It is. Ask me the question.
are you hiding Jews?
Why do you ask that?
I need to know if they're here.
Why do you feel that way about the Jews?
It doesn't matter. Are you hiding?
Why do you ask that?
Are you hiding?
So we could go forever and ever and ever. Right. I don't have to answer a yes or no. I don't have to answer the yes or no. I don't have to lie. It could result in my death. I get that. But I don't have to lie.
I kind of see that. I mean, that was kind of my point with Joseph, is that he wasn't deceiving someone. He was the person in charge. They came to see him. He was that person. He didn't put on a disguise, they came to see him. Him not revealing it as soon as maybe, I don't think I would have chosen to or anybody else did. It's just hard for me to see that he was like purposely trying to misguide them in somewhere, or lead them in a false doctrine, or deceive them in a way that's evil. He was exactly who he said he was. I mean, when they came and saw him, he was in Egypt. He was second in command. That's who he was. So I guess if they were to ask him, hey, are you Joseph? And he said, no. Well, yeah, he's lying. I think it was honorable that he revealed himself to them the way he did and welcomed them eventually after basically his decision was, do I need to protect my brother? He had a mission too that was power to say, hey, I wonder if they got Benjamin in a pit somewhere. I wonder what's going on with the family. Did they kill him too, or I don't know. That's my struggle. I think I struggle more with a police officer who goes undercover and says, I'm going to lie about everything. But most people would say, well, he's doing something good. He's not really deceiving. But it's hard to say he's not, and that's he put a disguise on, he had a mission. But people, they argue over that.
Yeah. That's why they're conundrums, right? The very, very difficult situations, and some of them are what ifs. Hopefully we're never in those situations, but hopefully I would act according to my conscience and to my best understanding of God's will, and do what I believe God is asking me to do, and God would require me as a faithful Christian. Those are difficult situations. Yes, Matt.
Ultimately, the example of the midwives and the example of Rahab, right? God found their actions favorable in His sight, right? Whether God considers it a lie or not is between the midwives and God, between Rahab and God. But what those examples that were given, they're favorable in God's sight. If I'm trying my best to do God's will, right, God will judge me for my actions. And if my actions are coming from trying to do God's will, I'm not saying lying, right? But those conundrums that we ultimately, it should be trying to do right in God's sight.
I agree. But your caveat, I'm not saying lying. It's like, okay, that's the problem.
But there's also like, in wartime, right? We don't tell our enemy our movements, right?
So somebody brought that up, the deceptions, the overwhelming deceptions for D-Day, right? During World War II, right? The Triple X Committee and all the different things they did to deceive. Were those wrong? Were those lies? Well, it depends again how you look on that. These are conundrums. So I want to move off this. I know. Yes, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Well, I mean, like you were saying, this is all like really good food for thought. This is obviously something we all need to think more on. If it's thinking about it, but something I thought about was, and this reasoning could be wrong. I don't know. This is just my thoughts. But there are times when, like, obviously Christians should not kill people, right? But if there is a case in self-defense, or if there is a case of times of war where you're fighting in battle, or we know suicide is wrong because it's self-killing, right? But if you lay your life down for a friend, it's commendable. So I'm thinking like it almost like triage, like we respond to the greater threat. Like in the case of, do I let this person know that I have kids in this closet, or do I say, I don't have kids? To me, it comes down to, do I protect my children, or do I lie? And I know, like, there's this scenario of, like, well, I just don't have to say anything. But there is an aspect of, like, people are smart. They kind of figure out, well, why are you avoiding the question? You're obviously you're not telling me something. And I think there's, like, to Ryan's point, I thought about that too. Like, what am I doing as a Christian if I'm just like, well, I'm not going to lie, so my kids are in the closet. I mean, you know what I mean? And I'm not trying to, like, question anyone's authority or anything like this. It's just, it is one of those questions where I guess we all kind of need to really take some time to
It is a conundrum. It is a conundrum. That's the best I can say. I would say, just because I want to actually answer the Santa Claus and Easter, at least from my perspective, when a child is too young to really understand the reality of the Santa story, is it lying, or is it just celebrating a tradition or a holiday tradition? Or the same with the Easter Bunny, is it lying if the kid is too young to even understand the difference between reality and make-believe? I don't believe it is. At some point, then you have to decide, hey, they can understand that there's no such thing as Santa Claus. You probably need to fess up that there's no such thing as Santa Claus. If you couldn't tell, we celebrate Christmas very much in our house. So that's and many more. I had other things that brought to me. This is a very difficult conversation. I think ultimately, when we look at this question, we have to act based upon what we know in the Bible. We have to act with a clear conscience. We have to obey the laws of the land until they contradict with God's law, and we have to obey God's law. We can't do things under the guise of following the political or the governmental law if that causes us to sin or transgress God's law. Oh. Okay. We have 15 minutes to cover today's discussion of. This is the other thing. Is there, the definition of lying is well understood or kind of agreed to, is telling an untruth, saying something that's not true, communicating something that's not true with the intent to deceive. And is there some other modifier to that? I couldn't come up with one. I really couldn't come up with one that made it okay. All right. So it goes back to those principles that we know how God feels. We know what's going to happen to liars. We have to avoid lying. Okay. For 15 minutes, let's talk about slander. So slander is the topic for this evening. And when I was studying for this class, I was really surprised about how often slander is mentioned in the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So let's discuss the definition of slander. Webster says it's making false charges or misrepresentations which defame or damage another's reputations. A Bible dictionary describes it as evil or malicious talk intended to damage or destroy another person. If you look at Psalms 31, it's kind of a nice, really kind of a good description of slander. Psalms 31 and verse 13, it reads, "For I hear the whispering of many, terror on every side, as they scheme together against me, as they plot to take my life." Slander, as I mentioned, is seen throughout the Bible. You can think about some very common stories, Jezebel and Naboth, Stephen in Acts 6, Paul is slandered by Tertullus in Acts 24, Jesus is slandered in front of the chief priests, and even the way they referred to him constantly as Jesus of Nazareth. Why do you think they referred to Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth? What happened in Nazareth? Nothing. Nothing good came out of Nazareth. That was meant as kind of a Jesus of Nazareth. You know where this guy is from, right? And his men, they follow Jesus of Nazareth, right? This is really kind of a dig at them. The Bible uses 3 different root words that are translated as slander in the scriptures. And I am not a Greek scholar. I'm not a Greek anything, so I'm going to butcher this, but blasphemeo, which means to speak in a disrespectful way that demeans, denigrates, or maligns. Diabolos, which we get the word for devil. Accusing falsely, usually with reference to the devil, but also is used in places where it talks about malicious gossips. And then katalaleos, to speak evil of. If you look at Romans 1, Paul lists it in Romans 1 when he describes characteristics of fallen humanity. You remember this whole description where these people have God's wrath is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress their truth. We'll look at chapter 1 and then look at verse 29 through 32. They didn't see fit to acknowledge God. Verse 29, they were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetous, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, and on it goes. Really, this vile description of evil characteristics. And then at the very end of that, it says, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things, they're deserving of death. Not only them, but those who encourage or give approval to those who practice them. So if you think about that definition, slander is wrong for a variety of ways. It's dishonest, it's deceitful, it's divisive, it's destructive. Those scriptures all kind of discuss that and kind of describe how that is true. But a slander really breaks confidences. It gossips. The deceitful, the word bewitched in Galatians 3 is the same as slander, false accusations that are made believable by the slanderer. It's divisive. The word there is translated whisperer. So this person destroys, by what they say, destroys close relationships with their words and is destructive, plotting those who are in need, is plotting their destruction. You think about the church in Corinth. The church in Corinth had some rough patches. They totally messed up the Lord's Supper. They were tolerating a reprehensible sin in their church family. And Paul says in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians that many actually had not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and sensuality that they had previously participated in. And these were members of the church. In chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians and in verse 20, it says, for I fear that perhaps when I come I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish, that perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. That was describing how he was concerned they were treating each other in their church family. Think about that. You're coming to church and your brothers and sisters are slandering, treating you hostile, jealousy, anger, gossip, conceit, disorder. That's horrible. That is horrible. He goes on to say that if you look at the in chapter 12, that they had not repented of their impurity, of the way they had sinned earlier. So real quickly here, we'll talk about this case study that's kind of an interesting case study. If you go to 2 Samuel, the 9th chapter, Ziba. Do you remember who Ziba was? Who was, in 2 Samuel, who was Ziba? Anybody remember who he was a servant of? Before Mephibosheth, he became the servant of Mephibosheth. He was a servant of Saul. All right, so he was the priest, and he was asked, is there anyone, David was looking around, is there anyone that remains of Saul's household? And they come up with this guy named Ziba. And they called to David, are you Ziba? He said, I am your servant. That's interesting, I am David's servant. And he says, I want to show some kindness to someone in the house of Saul. Is there anyone around? And Ziba says, yeah, there's a son of Jonathan by the name of Mephibosheth. And so we're not really sure what Ziba did before, but David gives him a job. He and his sons are all of a sudden told, you now exist to work the land of your master, Mephibosheth. You are going to provide so that he has food to eat. He's going to eat at my table, but you're going to provide so that he has food to eat. And we're not really sure what he knew, what he did before that. Maybe that was a step up for Ziba, but it was kind of interesting that it's like, okay, he said, Mephibosheth's alive, and now you're going to be taken care of. Well, in chapter 16, things are going poorly for King David. Very, very poorly. Absalom is rebelling. He has actually entered Jerusalem, and Ziba hatches this plot. Ziba hatches a plan. Look at verses 1 through 4 in chapter 16. When David had passed a little beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of donkeys saddled, bearing 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, why have you brought these? Ziba answered, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who faint in the wilderness to drink. And the king said, where's your master's son? Asking for Mephibosheth. Why are you here with this stuff? Why isn't Mephibosheth? And Ziba said to the king, behold, he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father. And King David gives everything that belonged to Mephibosheth to Ziba. But then the rest of the story comes about 3 chapters later when Absalom is killed. David comes back into Jerusalem. He's kind of dealing with his enemies from the rebellion. And we get to verse 24 of chapter 19. And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. And he had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. Does that describe to you somebody who said, hey, they're going to give me the kingdom back? No. What had Ziba done? He had lied and slandered and plotted against him. He was trying to get in on the good side. And David asked him, why didn't you come with me? And he explains that he was going to try and ride, but his servant was lame. He has slandered, talking about Ziba, he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the good angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. It's almost a very kind of Solomon-esque story, divide the baby. He's like, okay, hey, you're going to divide the property. We don't really have all the details there why he didn't just give it all back to Mephibosheth. But the bottom line is, we have an unscrupulous man telling a falsehood to gain an advantage and really destroying another person in the process. That is the essence of slander. What motivates people to slander others? So remember, think about this. This was in the church. This was in the church in 2 Corinthians. This was in the Corinthian church. This could be in other churches. God forbid this is here with us. I certainly have never seen this. But where does slander come from? What is the motivation behind slander?
Like most of it, selfishness.
Selfishness, Joe?
To gain power over someone if you can tear them down.
To gain power over someone, selfishness. Mark 7 says that it comes from within, it comes from our hearts. And if that comes from our hearts, what color are our hearts? Pretty black, right? This takes planning. This is premeditated. This is someone actively attacking, undermining, accusing, misrepresenting, falsifying, again, demeaning, trying to injure or hurt someone else for their own good. How do we avoid slandering others? Remember, in Romans 6th chapter, we're called to a new life, a new way of living, a new start as we become Christians. We are baptized into Christ Jesus. We're baptized into his death. We're buried with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. That is no longer part of our lives. If that was something that we had participated in before, that has to go away. In Colossians, the 3rd chapter, it's really a nice look at Colossians 3. Look at verse 5. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. It goes on to talk about including slander and lying. Nature abhors a vacuum. So if you're going to put those away, what do you got to fill it with? Otherwise, it just seeps back in, right? So yes, sir.
I think you have to fill that void with love, a perspective on other people that exalts others above yourself, and if you're going to assume the best of others, you're going to proactively be looking out for the best interest of others. If you don't constantly have that mindset about other people, the devil's going to always try to cause you to think badly of someone else, maybe based on the way they treated you or some slight or something.
Or envy or pride or, yeah. I love that. I wish I could remember say exactly the way you said that, but it's changing the perspective, the way that you see others, and love. And that is exactly right. Verse 12, you're supposed to put to death certain things. And in verse 12, you're supposed to put on, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, changing the way you see each other. Above all, verse 14, put on love, which binds everything. Now, you've got to get rid of those things, but you've got to fill it with those. And you've noticed the verbs that are used there. What does a verb mean? It's action. It takes work. It takes effort. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't happen by accident. It's something that we have to work on. 1 Peter 3, it talks about how we're treated and slandered and returning that with gentleness and respect. In 1 Peter 4, it says, verse 1 through 4, it says, arm yourself. Again, action. Arm yourself. Take action. Deliberate action to change the way we think, the way we act, and the way we live. And in verses 7 and 8 of 1 Peter 4, it talks about the end of things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly. Again, if we have turned to them, if we think about our brothers in a different way, out of love for them, out of concern for them physically, for their souls, we're going to treat them in a different way, and we're certainly not going to slander them. I'll leave you because we have less than 2 minutes left. We have to recognize that slander comes from within, wicked and evil thoughts. Instead, loving one another earnestly, thinking the best of one another, seeking to encourage one another. This is the prayer prompt for the week from 1 Peter 2, verses 1 and 2. I want you to think about this for the rest of the week. Putting aside, again, action. Putting aside malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all slander, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. Let's focus on putting away those evil things and desiring to grow in our faith, eagerly applying ourselves to the word. We'll close out there tonight. Appreciate everybody's participation. We'll see you on Sunday, Lord willing.